Hello, everybody. It's nice that we're all gathered here, and the J School is having their orientation, so thus the room setup is a little bit different. Usually we're sitting around a table staring at each other, so this is a little bit of a different setup. And it makes sense to accommodate all the masses of people that swarm when they hear that Trey Bundy and Mark Courtney are in town. So we're very happy to have these two. Generally speaking, the narrative of foster care has been painted in a great degree by the story of kids as they transition out of care. And I know this personally from when I started covering the system. This was what I really got into, and very quickly I found that my research led me to this guy from Chapin Hall, and then for a little while up in Washington State, who also happened to be a doctoral student here and teacher here at some point. No? Okay, got that wrong. But at any rate, so everything came back to Mark Courtney. And to say that that research with him and his team was as fundamental in changing child welfare policy as any research out there would not be an overstatement, I think. And the outcomes data was then taken by journalists like me, like Trey, like everybody else, and we ran with it. And a reason why we were able to run with it was also because we had, of course, access to those kids. They were over the age of 18. It was a lot of an easier story to tell. So in 2008, the culmination of all this coverage and all these waves of coverage that were kind of spurred by wave after wave of the Midwest study, culminated in the passage of the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, which brought with it a boatload of other provisions and mandates that really kind of are changing the face of child welfare in America. And so, we're very happy to have Mark here. I mean, I think it's a real honor to have you here, and I really appreciate you. You've got other things that you're doing here as well, but that you spent some time with us here is really great. And in terms of Trey, I was reading through. I've been a fan of Trey's for a while now. I think that we have kind of a similar ideological bent, which is that we can use our words to help kids. And I was reading. I just want to read you a paragraph how he started one of his pieces. This was back in 2010. I think you wrote this. The first time. What? Sorry. The first time I ever put my hands on an 8-year-old girl and held her down on the floor, I swore to myself that I would never do it again. It didn't matter that I was trained to do it or even that I was being paid to do it. I felt the same way the next 100 or so times I physically restrained children against their will, helpless and angry, though not at the kids. So Trey comes from a background working in group homes. Thought he could do more with this journalism. He went to the Bay Citizen with a kind of crazy plan to cover this issue area, and has become, in my estimation, one of the best voices in the country. So really happy to have you as well. So we're pretty informal here at Berkeley, and I think that we've got a lot of things going on in California with AB 12 and extension of foster care. And so maybe, Mark, you can start us out with what you're seeing, what you know, and what you want to impart to us, and then we can hear from Trey, and then I'm sure that the students and everybody else here has got burning questions. So.
Sure. Let me just start. I'll share a few numbers, mainly because if I don't, I'll share numbers, and if I'm not looking, they'll be wrong, and since there's journalists in the audience, I want to make sure they're right. But the first thing I would say is that I want to make clear that the research that I've been doing in this area is actually not evidence one way or the other as to whether foster care is good or bad. I think this guy hasn't used it for that purpose. But studying youth aging out of foster care is just that. It's really studying a particular population who was legally the responsibility of the state at the point that they became adults. And we can have a long discussion about that, but that's really what I set out to look at for a variety of reasons. One, because and this is, I think, relevant to journalists. I was interested in it from a practice standpoint. I worked in group care I've restrained young people, not as many, because I wasn't in a residential treatment center, so we didn't do it quite as much. But I know what that's like, and so I had a personal interest in, when I left practice, if you like, going back to school to try to help reform the child welfare system through knowledge and training students and things like that. So this is a population close to me personally. But if you were to ask me, why is this an interesting population? Why is there persistent interest in it? And I've been asked this by journalists actually for at least 15 years. Because they will write a story and then they'll realize that like a year later, wow, it's still a topic. And those of you in journalism realize that doesn't happen very often, right? I mean, taxes, the economy, stuff like this doesn't stay in the headlines very long. And I think the reason it stays in the headlines is for one primary reason, and that's demographic change, really, such that the transition to adulthood's become longer for young people in Western societies generally. So financial independence, living on your own, having kids, getting married, it happens several years, in some cases many years later in the life course now than it did 30 or 40 years ago. And the people in positions of power, if you think about how old they generally are, like in the peak of your career, you're in your 40s, 50s, whatever, they have young adult children. They have children who are making that transition. And the absurdity, they know how difficult that is, and it's actually quite normal now. Half of young people between 18 and 24 in this country are living with one or both of their parents. I'm not talking extended family, one or both of their parents, right? Lots of direct benefits, money, childcare, etc., provided well into the 20s and the 30s in many cases. And they know this, policymakers know this, including some very conservative policymakers. I sat in the Ways and Means Subcommittee way back in the 90s when this, I was doing research, this became a hot topic again after the 80s. And I was giving my numbers like this, and Tom DeLay showed up. You all know who Tom DeLay is, right? I mean, he's discredited now, but at the time before he was discredited, he was the second most powerful person in the Congress. This was a Republican Congress after Newt Gingrich. And he wanted to talk. And basically what he would say is, I'm a foster parent, and my kid became 18, and he lost his insurance, and that's just ridiculous. Of course we covered his insurance. We didn't kick him out. He made it quite clear to everybody in the audience he had not been an irresponsible parent. But I think the reason that the policy salience around this isn't just kids who are in foster care. And my research is not about the outcomes of foster care. It's about a particular population that has real salience to elites, really, policymakers in the country, and probably will for some time to come, unless the transition to adulthood changes, or we fundamentally change policy so that this isn't that big of a concern anymore, right? So that's the most important thing I wanted to say, is that to me is kind of the story and why this is interesting. It's also interesting because the outcomes aren't good. So I've got a study, and it's available on the web, and those of you in the class got some reading from it. And I don't need to go on into the outcomes. I mean, in general, the outcomes in general are not pretty in terms of education, employment, family formation, young people having kids, long before they're really able to support them, crime, risk behaviors, victimization of the young people themselves. If you frame it as you're a parent, right? Think of it that way. These were our kids. They were in our care. Wow, this is troubling on average. And I think the other part of the story that's very important is one size doesn't fit all in terms of interventions, and this population is a very heterogeneous population. So one of the other papers I like to discuss is where we said, okay, that's the average, and that's a really troubling, disturbing story. But another part of the story is there's actually fairly distinct groups within this population, right? And two of those groups actually are doing reasonably well. One group we call accelerated adults. They've made a lot of transitions early. They're actually living on their own. They've all finished high school. About half of them have at least some college. They're staying out of trouble with the law. About half of them have kids, but they're pretty much parenting all those kids. But a lot of them are poor. They're still, having a difficult time. And actually, we ask a set of questions. We call them the adultera question. How quickly have you had to grow up? And this is the group most likely to say we had to grow up faster than our peers. And we asked that question in a way that was asked in a big national study, and they're much more likely, not just than the other kids aging out of foster care, but much more likely than people the same age in the general population say, yeah, I had to grow up way too quickly. Right. So this is a group that needs help, but it's actually not a group that needs like a whole lot of intensive therapy. They're not committing a whole lot of crime. They probably need continuing help in college. Our latest wave of data suggests 1 out of 5 of these young women are in college at 26. That's actually, I think, a bit higher than the rate of young women who are 26 generally in college. What's happening? They're late to the game. It's not surprising. It's taken them a while. Life has happened, foster care happened, abuse, neglect happened. But actually this group, which makes up over a third of these young people, with a little bit of help, I think, could do well. For example, extending those vouchers, education and training vouchers, to 26 or 27. Very well targeted intervention, by the way. You're only going to give it to folks who were aged out of foster care, managed to be at that point. It doesn't cost much, why not? There's another population we call emerging adults. There's a bunch of you in the room that Jeff Arnett would call emerging adults, right? He's a psychologist, coined this term. The 20s are a period of experimentation. We're figuring out what we're going to do with relationships, jobs, etc., which is true for a lot of young people. Not so true for very poor young people, not true for young people coming out of the juvenile justice system, maybe not so true for many people coming out of foster care, but for about a quarter of the young people in my study, a little over a quarter, they look very much like that. Again, they need some help, but it's not heavy lifting. Then there's 2 other groups that need a lot of help, and it probably is much heavier lifting. One of the groups we call struggling parents. They're primarily female. They make up about 25% of these young people. They account for over half of the kids of these young people. Only about a third of them have a high school diploma or GED at 26. Very few of them are working, and a lot of them don't have any paid work history. 3/4 of them are using some kind of needs-based public assistance, very low levels of social support, lots of economic hardship, being homeless, having utilities cut off, etc. So what's happened is basically their life has become dominated by parenting under very difficult circumstances. They're not doing it well. They're still overwhelmingly parenting their own children, but this is a group you got to worry about. Some of them have lost custody of some of those children. It's a group you got to worry about over time, not just them, but their kids. And we probably need a lot of help for them around parenting, and then getting them to be able to go support their parenting, and then let's help them go back to school, get some work experience, etc. And then the last group, about 1/5 of the population, primarily young men, we call troubled and troubling. The one thing about this method is coming up with the statistics spit it out really nicely, and you can look at the statistics and you got to come up with a way to describe it, and it's hard. And I hate to call any group of people troubled and troubling, but these are young people who overwhelmingly are either homeless, institutionalized, or bouncing from one place to the next. They have overwhelmingly been convicted of crimes, have juvenile and adult justice system involvement, high rates of homelessness. Only 10% of them are working. And while 40% of them, about 40% of them have children, none of them are living with those children. So if we wanted to prevent kids who end up not living with their parents, pretty good targeting here with this group. But this group is going to need lots of help. Really high rates of substance abuse, mental health problems. And this is a group back at 17, when we first talked to them, we asked a series of questions of how prepared do you feel to be on your own? This group was dead last. They told us when they were 17, I have no business being on my own. I need a lot of help. And they still need help at 26, right? So this is a subgroup, and a lot of them would have been in residential treatment. And they're going to need a lot of support along the way, or in the absence of that support, we're going to see what we see in our study. So I'll shut up at this point.
I mean, we'll get into it, but I mean, one question that I just kind of, you don't need to answer now, but we could talk about, the implementation of the Fostering Connections Act and kind of the standards you need to hit, and how that troubled and troubling fits into that puzzle of, of eligibility for extended foster care. So
we can do that. We can talk specifically about California too. So.
Yeah. So anyway, it's just something I kind of want to put out there. Trey, you've mentioned in your writings about what the cost is essentially of not getting it right? You talk about that quite a bit. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, after hearing Mark speak in general.
Well, I think that the fourth group, the 1/5, the troubled and troubling, I mean, we talk about the cost of failing with that group. It's explosive. It's huge. It's beyond comprehension, I think. I think the ripple effect of not treating those kids is disastrous. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Oh, yeah.
Over dinner, you were talking a little bit about how we target which groups to target. And I didn't catch exactly, is this the group that you're focused on?
Well, I think we can target all of the groups, but it's different task, right? I mean, I think that group needs a lot of help across a number of dimensions. And we actually have a pretty good sense of who they are. So another paper we did looking at subgroups back at 17, and we had a group, I forget the name of it, but it's something akin to troubled and troubling, and they're 3 times as likely at 26 to be in the troubled and troubling group as in either of those other good groups. Right? So it's not perfect. I don't want to stick, like these groups are fluid. People move in and out of them, right? But you could identify young people who are very high risk of those kinds of outcomes back at 17, probably earlier, and know that you really need to, pay a lot of attention to them. There's some others actually doing okay back then, and we're doing some things like that in California. The programs in California around young people aging out of care who are in college, guardian scholars, things like that. We have actually some of those things in place in California. There's other states where we actually don't have that. Right? I mean, so the lay of the land differs, depends on where you are, right?
There's something different happening in California now too that's a part of this. I don't know if you guys have talked about it, but realignment.
Yeah.
And juvenile realignment, but also adult criminal justice realignment is a piece of this too, because once they're 18, that's where they are. And that's a huge issue, whether you're a reporter or whether you're a social worker or a policy person. I mean, the potential of realignment is terrific. I think the idea is that counties are going to be developing more practices that are not based on incarceration. They're based on therapy, rehabilitation, those types of things. There's going to be some resistance. I think there's a lot of people that look at kids when they're 22 years old. They've been in foster care for a long time. They're still getting in trouble, and they think that kid's, why are we investing anything in that kid? I don't get to write this so much anymore because I'm not a columnist anymore. I do straight news. But I think that's a mistake to be looking at those kids like that. I think the innovations that we're potentially going to see over the next 5 years, if realignment takes full effect, are going to surprise a lot of people in terms of crime rates going forward. So I think that's something that everybody should be thinking about when you're thinking about AB 12 implementation, because and AB 12 is not a catch-all for all kids who are having a hard time either. We talked about this a little bit at dinner too. There's if you talk to a CPS worker in California, they're going to tell you that when we take a kid away, more often than not, at this point, we're not going to put them into residential treatment, a group home. The buzzwords now are kinship, community care, that type of thing. And that started about 12 years ago. And if anybody who's been around for a while could look around the Bay Area and see that most of the kids' residential facilities have been shut down in the last decade. You've lost Children's Garden, you've lost Sunny Hills, Edgewood's smaller, Seneca is getting ready to close its San Francisco facility. They just closed one in Concord. And this has been the trend for about the last dozen years. It's cheaper not to put kids into residential facilities. But what's being said a lot is that this is really all about keeping kids with their families. That's where we get the best outcome. If you talk to CPS workers, what they're liable to tell you, what they tell me, is it's a great idea. But more often than we'd like to admit, what happens when we take a kid out of an abusive situation, we find anybody who will take him. Anybody. A neighbor down the street, a teacher, do you know this kid? Then they have 2 choices. They can either make that a dependency placement of some kind, or they can make it a probate. Right, exactly. You guys know this stuff. The probate.
Well,
guardianship.
we just had Amy Lemley in here talking about probate guardianship.
Well, with AB 12, the probate guardian kids are not eligible for services. Right now, they're not eligible for independent living services. It's not the biggest population in the world, although I know in a lot of counties that's more often than any other kid they take away is these probate guardian situations. But we are talking about any given case, you could be dealing with a kid who, without intensive ongoing services, is going to be one of the people that costs everybody a lot of money, because hurting themselves, hurting others, costing taxpayers, prison, those types of things. So when I think of AB 12, I think it's good to, from a coverage standpoint as a reporter, it's good to look around AB 12, peripheral to that, that piece of legislation, because there's a lot happening on the edges regarding the population that I think we're all concerned with.
And just, we just had, so Amy Lemley in here, and she gave us an amazing primer on realignment, which I think none of us had much of a way of conceptualizing in our brain beforehand. And one thing that she brought up that I really want to take advantage of as both someone doing research and someone reporting on research is, she said, what is it that we're not going to see? What are we going to miss in terms of what are the outcomes that are not going to be visible, but really will kind of show us a picture of what's happening when we are starting to shrink child welfare agencies and child welfare programs? And I thought that was a very interesting question for research. I mean, you'll see when things go terribly and they show up in the news, but what can you look for as a kind of pre-indicator was her question to us.
Wow. I think it's, I think of it as a researcher, and actually the first part of this, you could think of it as a journalist, is unless we're out there asking questions of the people who provide a variety of services right now around how their life changes in realignment, we will know nothing. Right? Because the data infrastructure, at that level, the data infrastructure doesn't really exist. I mean, you can look at utilization of some things, but the state probably won't even do that because it doesn't have the capacity, and now it's not responsible.
Right.
So I just had a conversation with some legislative staff who are developing legislation in the state to actually do that, to sort of require the state agencies to share data and sort of create a knowledge infrastructure, if you like, using state data. Partly because they were concerned about this, but they're for good reasons too. They want to look at outcomes under AB 12, for example, but they have a much broader agenda there. But, they shared with me they're fairly skeptical that the agencies, state agencies, some ambivalent about that. So I think that sort of qualitative research, if you like, or journalism is the most likely place to find it is you're going out talking to people who used to do or still do. The problem is some of them will be used to do, right? Because if the counties eliminate services or cut services, then you're looking to try to talk to somebody who used to do something, right? But I think if it's not going well, that's the first way we'll find out about it. And actually the idea that you'll hear the horror stories, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, because the horror stories will be people whose lives aren't as good as they otherwise would be, right? Who aren't getting help they used to get, et cetera. And the county agencies, for the most part, don't have any interest in drawing attention to that, right? I mean, if you're a county welfare director or whatever, and your boss, your board or whatever says, carry this out and make this work, and it's not working, there'll be some county welfare directors come, on their way out, who say this isn't working and here's why, right? But for the most part, their job is to say it's working, right? And so, bearing witness to it through, investigative journalism is really important. And the trick is being able to tie the stories of people who aren't getting what they need with the folks who used to do it, right? And make that case. A lot of, in principle, good things could come out of, realignment. Hopefully the counties went along with this because they made some calculations that they actually think they can deliver services more effectively. But, that's kind of not exactly what I hear, So I think, generally devolution in the absence of the central authority deciding we're going to become the watchdog, if you like, right? So the state saying, we're really going to watch this. We're going to create a knowledge infrastructure. We're going to use the administrative data we have. We're going to do some surveys. We're going to see whether it's working or not. In the absence of that, it's difficult, if not impossible, actually, to know. And 10 years later, people try to sort of figure it out and pick up the pieces. I hate to be that pessimistic, but
well, one of the parts of the realignment bill includes the creation of a state body that's supposed to do that, and we'll see what that body does or turns into. The idea, though, is that the state would leave the direct service business and go strictly into the oversight business.
If the state takes that seriously, by the way, that's not, there are states that kind of operate that way now anyway. When I was in Wisconsin, that was basically the function of state government. It was a county administered system. There was something called the community aids budget. It looks a lot like what you're doing, And there were some questions of whether it was always constitutional, because they take things like foster care money and just give it out in block grants to states or to counties, And actually, the federal government said, we don't actually care. You've leveraged that much federal money for foster care. If you give it to county A and they have nobody in foster care, that's your business. I was amazed, but foster care, in-home support services, a lot of stuff, we're just wrapped into this fund, we're doing it for years. And then the state ostensibly was, looking and providing an accountability function. It did a lousy job of that. I mean,
Sure.
it just didn't, really couldn't do it. So there's all kinds of stuff you didn't know in Wisconsin.
Well, I mean, Amy was very emphatic when she was here that the state does have this possibility of an oversight function now, and they can bring, they can essentially put counties into receivership, and,
Yeah.
they can punish them whenever they want. It's never happened, right?
Right.
So, and her point is, it's never happened when they were putting 20% of the money in. Now they're going to put 0 in. So the likelihood you're going to have any oversight, she would contend, or there is that contention in some circles that you're not going to have any. You're not. The oversight's gone.
Well, sure.
And so, what does that mean for, from your perspective, Troy? I mean,
Well, I mean, I think it's look, the state hasn't been able to manage to supervise itself in its 5 remaining, or 4 now remaining juvenile justice facilities well enough to escape the clutches of a lawsuit that is now 7 years old. I mean, so, and I've done countless stories on California Social Services and their oversight of county CPS programs and things like that. No, the oversight, it's abysmal from the state level. There's no question about it. So, I mean, the idea is, do you allow it to, for instance, with the juvenile prisons, do you allow them to sit and let and atrophy under the state's supervision quietly, or do you send the kids back home, to their counties, and hope that the counties will do a better job, because they're the ones that ultimately have to live with these people when they get out. I mean,
but you lose the. I mean, so you lose the federal, the federal. I mean, in the child welfare sense, you lose the federal entitlement piece to the puzzle, right? So the reason why you have to do this, because there's this federal entitlement, but eventually, the argument would be that just erodes and erodes and erodes because there's nobody really looking after it anymore. So you stop taking kids in the same way you used to. That's the argument under the realignment.
into the juvenile justice system?
No, into the foster care
Into the
system.
foster care system.
You stop taking kids in because, the counties still have an interest in the state claiming, federal foster care, right? I mean, why would the counties want to be stuck with 100% of that bill?
Well, yeah. Why would they want to be? I think, yeah, sure. But,
Yeah, I think counties have an incentive in staying out of this situation where, and the federal government doesn't do it that way. The federal government doesn't deny Title IV money to a county. It denies it to the state. And it can do it based on a state, based on their observation that the state is somehow failing to follow the rules of the Title IV program. But I'm not aware, somebody correct me, and Joe, somebody might know. I didn't get the sense of realignment that the state's deciding, we don't care, don't want to claim 4E anymore. So those provisions, going to court, licensing, that kind of stuff, I expect that the counties are going to want to follow that stuff, because it won't be Children's Rights Inc. or the Juvenile Law Center. It won't be the litigants who come after it. It'll be the federal government who comes and says they'll do their system audit and say, you're not dotting your I's and crossing your T's, and here's a penalty. And those penalties can get big over time. And the federal government has levied those. It actually didn't used to do that, ironically, but in recent years it has levied those. You talk to New York State, and there's some places that have paid, some big fines for not doing what they need to do under 4E. But I think, a different question is, litigation. So you have litigation in California, but the litigators tend to only sue big jurisdictions. LA will get sued. Butte County won't get sued. Alpine County, they don't bother. It's not worth the effort. It's too much effort. There's almost the same amount of effort to sue Alpine County as to sue, well, maybe not as much because they're kids, you could read all the cases in one day. But, you get my point. It's like the legal issues are very similar, suing a small county as suing LA, right? But, sue LA, you get your legal fees, you can affect a big system. So it's not a coincidence that the jurisdictions that get sued in this country tend to be states or large counties, right? You could have gone to Illinois or to Wisconsin when I was there and sued a whole bunch of counties, not just Milwaukee. In fact, 3 county directors showed up at the press conference where Children's Rights sued Milwaukee, said, please sue me. And they never did. Said, well, and they literally wanted that because they thought they'd get the political will to reform their system, right? They get money. Milwaukee County started getting $30 million more a year when the state lost that lawsuit. But, you know, they'll sue the county and the state. And ultimately it'll be Greg Rose or whatever, you know, somebody versus Jerry Brown et al. And et al. Will be state people and county people. But unfortunately, a whole lot of places in the state, it'll never affect them, that kind of advocacy.
So you anticipate wider variance from county to county?
Yeah, there's probably pretty wide variance now.
Yeah.
But, I mean, but the state could, I mean, this, you know, I mean, it's a matter of advocacy and bearing witness to it and the political will, right? I mean, the state, I don't think there's anything actually inherently wrong with this idea of giving people flexibility at the county. You have a county-run system. Why? Right? I mean, presumably you have a county-run system because you think that people are closer to where the needs are and stuff at the counties, and that county government will do a better job. It's consistent with the whole, what is it, principle of subsidiary, right? Allow the level of government that's closest to the problem that can actually solve it to solve the problem, right? But if that fails, you want to have evidence that it's failing, and you want to have the ability of higher levels of government to step in a coherent, thoughtful way. And that's the question around realignment is, you know, are the mechanisms really there, and is there political will for that to happen, right? Because quite often at the county level, the county board, what I would worry about in a context like this is county governments literally saying, we're perfectly happy. It just goes back to English poor law. We're perfectly happy for those poor people to go away. We make services miserable, they'll go away. They'll go to some other county. Right now in this state, I know from talking to social workers, you have folks who will apply for aid, and what's the first thing, not to child welfare, but they apply, let's say, for substance abuse treatment. First thing, social workers, what's your address? Ooh, you're in the next county. Yes, you live a hell of a lot closer to services right here than you do the services in your county, but so what? You live in the next county. Go fish, right? So that's kind of what we do when we create a county administrative system. That will happen, right, quite often. So you got to worry when everything gets rolled out in the state. There's not much oversight by the state that happens a lot.
Yeah, we'd love to hear questions, but I would also like to talk a little bit also about, you know, AB 12 implementation, because you guys are both, you have some experience understanding that stuff. So, but are there any questions? Wow.
This is the first time ever. Come
First
on.
time ever.
I do have one question. So, you Mark, said something interesting, or something that caught my attention, specifically, which is, what's the evidence that it is failing? So if we're going to do, if in theory, realignment can work, what is it that the journalists in the room need to look at, need to pay attention to measure? And I know Amy previously talked about what's that temperature? How do we read the temperature of the system? Because there's really, not a way of doing that right now. So what should we be looking at? What should we be keeping our eyes peeled for? So do you have any ideas on that?
Well, on the child welfare side, I mean, the realignment affects a lot of things, right? But the child welfare side, actually, the state has kind of, has metrics, right? It has some kind of reasonable data around who's entering the system, what are the outcomes of child abuse investigations, how long are kids there, where do they go. They're creating an information infrastructure around older youth, right, and outcomes for older youth. They have something called Efforts to Outcomes, and they have some forms, and there's actually some great work in the counties where they've implemented Efforts to Outcomes. So, what I would want to do is give it a little bit of time for those kinds of data, but then go and ask for those and say, look at them and talk to somebody and have them explain it to you. What do you think the trends mean? And I think there are actually a lot of great people working in human services in California. There are going to be some places where things counties are quite sincere, and they're trying to make this work, and they'll have data, and they'll be able to talk to you about whether they think it's working or whether it's not, and that would be really useful to have. But when you go to counties and they say, well, we don't really have any data, or we don't know, or whatever, and then other counties do, that's informative in and of itself, right? I mean, that tells you something, that only dumb luck is going to make things be good in the counties where they're just not paying attention to it, right? Because if they're not paying attention, where they actually have kind of information they're a learning organization, or there are some learning organizations that are trying to understand what's working and making changes in response to this and seeing how the outcomes change. And then there are other jurisdictions where that's just not happening. I'm pretty sure that's not the only thing that's not happening, right? And, you know, as a journalist, that's when you want to start asking hard questions. That might be a good place to go and talk to some folks who used to, or maybe still work in the county, and, you know, try and get them to talk to you about how things are going. But on the child welfare side, California has, you know, it's not perfect. We'd like to have more, I'm sure, but it has a data infrastructure. It goes back a ways, and you can look at those changes over time. Barbara Dell and her crew, you know, they've been working with counties around that for a long time. And in my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that the County Welfare Drugs Association, I mean, they're on board for continuing to do that kind of data monitoring. Is that right? No?
Yes.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So that's good, right? That's a good sign. You know, when they start bowing out of that, you know, counties, when the data, I mean, and there are data quality issues. So she's, you know, and her folks are somebody to talk to, right? Because, if, you know, you'll know. I mean, you'll see if the data quality, you begin to wonder, like, whether you feel comfortable sharing data because you wonder where it's coming from, right? Those are the kinds of things that you need to worry about. Because when that happens, that's generally a sign that's not the only thing that's going wrong.
Ray?
So part of the when Daniel first started talking about this class, part of the reason I was interested is because I've always thought, and this is what I was mentioning to Trey earlier, that the press plays a really vital role in government accountability. And like I happen to think that you're right, that realignment could work out and could wind up creating a better system than the one that we've got. I think the fact that it will start in an environment of really scarce resources means that in the first couple of years, it's essentially the devolution of responsibility for making some gnarly cuts and dealing with however the public relates to that. And so I run an advocacy organization, it's Coalition of Providers, and we've been going to the board and saying we want to know when you're talking about things, how you're talking about them, we want to participate in those conversations. And one thing they always say is, you guys don't access our public forums very frequently. Right, meeting board meetings, meeting commission hearings, and they draw the comparison to the senior advocacy community. When there's a budget item up that's going to affect seniors, the chambers are packed. When there's a budget item up that's going to affect foster kids, there's me and whoever I bring with me. And a lot of times, 3 or 4 or 5 of the people who RSVP drop off because they've got another meeting or whatever. And so I wonder, and I bring it up because there's no news organization that I know of that's regularly in those meetings at the local level where realignment is going to play out, where boards are going to make decisions about first how to allocate cuts, hopefully eventually about how to allocate growth. And I'm wondering how the community draws together its resources to inform the public, to engage the public, to get people out there to understand how these things are happening, so they can really influence. Otherwise, I don't see any possibility for accountability on the broader, you know. So that's a question. Given the limited resources, how do we activate the broader constituency to participate in the process of realignment?
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, first, let me ask you a question. When you go to these meetings and you show up and you have a couple of people with you, they're probably not used to anybody showing up. Is that right?
That's right.
Do they act like they're happy to see you?
No.
No, they don't.
And sometimes they're not even there either.
Right.
The Social Services Committee meeting, regardless of our current Board of Supervisors situation right now, I mean, only 1 or 2 members of the committee will likely be there. Even on big votes, you know, they complain if they have to interrupt their travel schedule to come back to vote.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and that's not surprising. I mean, I go to Juvenile Justice Commission meetings. I go to Youth Commission meetings.
Right.
And I go to meetings as I have time to do them. You know, it's a great thing to do. That was one of my original pitches when I pitched the idea of a child welfare beat to the Bay Citizen. I mean, I'd been at the Chronicle before that. I've been pitching these types of stories for a year and a half, and you know, they didn't want a child welfare reporter. Nobody really does. I think that can change, but that was my whole pitch. Was like, look, who's hanging around family court? You know, who's hanging around these dependency courts? Who's hanging around the juvenile justice courts? Holding judges accountable for abuse proceedings, those types of things. Because you're right, nobody's really doing it unless there's an incident, and then you see a bunch of reporters, and then they're gone the next day. Is anybody in here thinking of being a journalist and covering child welfare, juvenile justice, just like kids issues, youth issues? You are? Okay. One?
Well, I mean, I wonder if there's a space
Well, you
for...
just convinced the rest of them there's no future.
Actually, I'll tell you a story though too. Check it out, because I worked with kids for 12 years in group homes, and I went to school to become a social worker. And while I was there, I decided, nobody's really writing about this consistently, even though some people write about it well. People write opinion stuff, but nobody's really writing. This is not a beat anywhere. And so, 2 months after I got out of school, I got a job at the Bay Citizen, which does the Bay Area section of the New York Times, the day that it launched. So that's because nobody's doing that. So if you think that there's no future in writing about kids, it's wide open. There are plenty of stories. There are plenty of meetings that nobody's going to. And it's absolutely a growth industry as far as I can tell.
Well, and I think there are stories there. I mean, basically, not to, denigrating my journalism friends in the room, but journalism is a business. You got to have good stories people want to read, and then you can sell advertising or whatever, whatever you need to do in terms of the business model. And you're right that unlike the senior lobby, the NAMI, you're going to cut services to people with serious mental illness. A whole lot of people will show up, right? Because they got parents. They have. These are things where there are reasonably privileged constituencies who are getting good things out of government. And they show up and demand that those things not be taken away, which is rational behavior on their part, right? We're talking about people who can't do that. Kids can't. CYC, by the way, the California Youth Kids, there are foster youth who are organized and are very effective, right? Not generally at the county level, although I understand CYC has some county chapters. But the folks who generally show up around child welfare issues or juvenile justice issues or whatever are providers. Right? And I was in that role myself here 20 years ago for the California Association of Children's Homes. And it was a righteous thing to do in the sense that we were representing, but we were also representing our own business interests, right? And I'm not saying that's, we should do that. That's our job. And we were in a good business, right? But if we're the only ones showing up at these things, it's always a little iffy, right? Whereas a journalist showing up and just asking smart questions and then putting it on a blog or, whatever, that's enormously powerful because you're there for a different reason. And you can actually give voice, ask the questions that the people affected by these systems would love to ask, but they either can't or they're demonized. Some mom showing up who had her kids taken away, God, I wouldn't subject her to that. The likelihood of that being a really unpleasant experience for her is pretty high in front of a lot of county boards. There's going to be some county board member who just berates the hell out of that poor person. And that'll be the last time she should. You get a group of them together maybe, but you start thinking of the constituencies for these systems, they're just, they don't show up. It's like, rarely does that happen. So journalists can be, I think, really powerful.
Well, what's the role, and this is something, and Barbara, I sat and talked to Barbara at length today, and Barbara was kind of talking about the work she's done around, how data is misused in the public discourse and how headlines can be completely erroneous and flip you totally off course. And you had one great example of can you just give the example because it's so good, the highest incidence rate, or what was it again?
Well, this was I believe it was a San Francisco Chronicle article that used the data that we report quarterly on our website on the federal metrics, which, don't get me started on the problems with the federal metrics, but they are what they are, and it's a measure about abuse in foster care. And the numerator is the number of children who are abused in foster care during the year, and the denominator is the number of kids served in foster care. And they ran with a headline that a certain Bay Area county was the worst county in the Bay Area in terms of their rate of abuse in foster care. And the county director called me and said, Barbara, remind me why it's such a good idea to have publicly available data. And when I looked at the data, the numerator was a 1. And it was a very small county. And so even with 1 child in foster care, their rate, the percent was higher than the other Bay Area counties, but it was a clear example, and there are many more, of where a group, their rate was higher than the other Bay Area county, but totally inappropriate attack on the county because of this one child. The next quarter, that one turned to a 0, so they went from being the worst county in the Bay Area to being the best county in the Bay Area.
Well, I mean, that just brings
They
up.
should have wrote that story too.
Well, that brings up the idea of one, to what degree was there a backlash, and to what degree do social welfare institutions have to be ready to understand their own data and speak about it in a different way? But then two, Mark, you've definitely been a part of a lot of conversations that have led to great social change, right? But I mean, to what degree are researchers capable and as willing as they need to be, or practitioners, to kind of entering into that discourse? I mean, now we have the capacity for everybody to be on a platform and everybody to be their own, essentially a public intellectual. So to what degree do researchers have to enter that fray? And I mean, who's the journalist anymore?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a tricky business. I talk about my own experience in that regard. I think one of the reasons that people will talk to me about something is because I'm not an advocate and not a journalist. And so, rightly or wrongly, there's this sense of trust that I will not lie to them and I will not distort the numbers, etc. And that is kind of my job. I should do that. I take that quite seriously, and I train my students to do that. That being said, I'm doing it because I hope that the work that I do will illuminate public discourse and lead to better policy. And in some cases, in a lot of cases actually, there are clearly things not to do, and then there may be things that would probably be better for us to at least try and see whether they work. I'll say that, but I tend not to go out and beat the drum and make a big deal out of it. Mainly because I think it undermines us researchers, right? If we're perceived of as going beyond the data, if we're perceived of as shifting from being a source of information for journalists, policymakers, etc., when they have a question, and we do the best job we can to answer it, as opposed to we're going to tell you what to do. We're like all the other people telling you what to do. So it's kind of, for me, a function of where do I think I could be most effective to move public policy discourse, as opposed to, that's really it. And so I've chosen to generate these kinds of data where it seems to me pretty clear, well, this seems to be working a lot better than that. I just come around and say that, right? And then if I'm in a policy context and they say, well, if we had a policy choice of this or this, what do you think we better? Well, based on the data I have, this is probably better than that. But I don't lobby. I don't, I don't get up and let's storm the barricades, Not that I've done that. Actually, pictures of me doing that in Sproul Plaza, 30 years ago. But and at some point in my life, I might shift, and do that, right? I mean, I see myself in retirement here in California, causing a lot of hell in county boards and stuff like that, But at that point, I'm in a different role. So I try to put one of the reasons at Chapin Hall, we really tried to beef up our website, and we do webinars and all that kind of stuff, is we want to get this stuff out there to all of you, right? So that you'll use it effectively, right? And honestly, not distort the data and all that. And we do that. Barbara does that. We spend a lot of time actually trying to get people to understand how to use data and not misuse data. But we're doing that not just because that's a cool thing to do, but because we actually want to have an impact. You'll find a lot of researchers that want to have an impact. And people in this world, if they don't want to have an impact, I kind of want to why are you doing this? Why are you there? It's just like you didn't have the social skills to succeed at something else, and you're smart. You're really smart and can learn regression models and write journal articles, and you couldn't succeed anywhere else. I mean, I say that. I mean, there are folks like that, and I wish they'd be more thoughtful about, okay, what is their data going to be used for? We do have. So I guess I would say yes. We're very privileged people. A tenured faculty member at a university in this society is one of the most privileged people on the planet, flat out. And in school of social work in particular, I think we have a profound responsibility to use that privileged position to be useful. And research is what we're doing. Let's make it useful.
My question is for Trey, which I might add your article, which are phenomenal. Thanks. One thing, a characteristic that even has come up in this class a lot of time is that journalists are sensationalists. We sensationalize stories, and seeing that your interest were reported by the juvenile justice system, how did you deal with not the issue, but when you came across data like that, was it important to you to make sure that that data was put into context in your stories to ensure that just it wasn't misunderstood by the audience reading it? Like, how did you approach addressing that topic?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Particularly when I switched from doing sort of editorializing to just doing hard news, that became really important. And it's really important because most of the institutions that purport to protect children and supervise others who do, they're not used to very much media scrutiny. And to a large extent, they feel, I mean, it's usually a sense of shock when I call a county, human services agency or Department of Social Services for the first time. And when I call back again, and when I do that third records request, I get, what do you think you're, why on earth, you know? It's like I landed here from Mars with a ray gun, and well, as though they don't work, you know, operate on taxpayer dollars, you know, as though they're not, you know, saying that they're beyond reproach because they care for the most vulnerable citizens and those types of things. So when you're going to do a story that says, for instance, I did a story on this group home in Alameda County. It's the only high-level group home emergency shelter for in Alameda County. It's where they take 16, 17-year-old kids who are high-risk kids in crisis situations, and they dump them there. It's not a secure facility.
That's what I used to do.
That's what I used to do. And there's one of these in Alameda County. There's actually 3 group homes, but they're operated by the same people. And just from digging around and having some conversations, I found a stack of documents about that big and went through and counted. They had 118 violations against their group home from community care licensing at the state level over a 10-year period. And for various things, human rights violations, for hitting kids, for stealing their money, for all kinds of stuff, you know. And if you call the social services in Alameda, they'd say this place is great, nothing's ever gone wrong here, you know. So when you're going to do a story like that, and then you know, if you call the state, they say, well, it's really not as bad as it looks. Everybody's trying to protect this horrible facility, you know. And I don't mind saying, because at this point I've talked to dozens of people who've worked there over the years. You know, but you better have your data right, because you're pissing off a lot of people, and they even tried to come at me and say it wasn't 118. You know, we're going to sue you for this article, the whole thing. Of course, it was. They were figuring if the violations happened on the same day, that counted as one, even if it was like 10 of them. But the point is, yeah, you have to have that stuff right. I mean, absolutely, and it doesn't hurt to have. I mean, I'm lucky. we have data researchers at the Bay Citizen. You know, seasoned data reporters who actually know how to look at the work that you do. I mean, I don't have a clue. You know? I sit, I look at it, I go, okay, I'm right. I have a lot of questions, and I go over and I talk to the geniuses in my shop, and they spend a week going over the data, and then they come back and explain it to me, and that's usually how it works.
That's
I
great.
don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is Eve and I were just talking about this prior to, and last session, Eve kind of brought up this discussion of what ethical coverage of these issues are, and we were talking about, you know, also we're working on this issue of the open juvenile dependency courts and trying to do this thing where we ratify a code of ethics, right? Which is a kind of outlandish idea, but whatever. And so this idea is built around this idea of building a code of ethics that would be applicable. And one thing we were talking about was, you know, like you mentioned, this question of, you know, how do you know that you've got the context right and all that kind of stuff. So as you know, researcher, you know, how much would you like us to read before we start citing your stuff? You know, and do you think it's feasible to create a kind of set of, you know, like is there some kind of mini curriculum that you think that folks need if they're going to cover this in an ethical manner or something like that? Is that reasonable?
So those are 2 different questions. If you're going to become a child welfare beat, you know, reporter, then yeah, I think you should take my class. You know, something like that. Yeah, I mean, I think that you really ought to do some pretty serious homework ahead of time, if that's what you want to do. Because it is very complicated, and there are many more ways for you to screw it up than there are for you to get it right. With respect to somebody's research and what it means and what you want to make of it, I'd call them up. You know, I see that as a really important part of my work. For every conversation I have with a journalist where my name or my research gets cited anyway, I have 10 other conversations. And I'm quite happy at that ratio. That's fine with me, right? Because I see that as public education. Have that conversation, help this person get an understanding of the nuance of this, and I did a good public service in doing that, right? And I do see people, I mean, there are journalists who actually, this issue of being sensationalist, I mean, yeah, I mean, your editor has to decide this is an important story. Like, that's a good way to frame it as opposed to we want to be sensationalistic. But I got to tell you, I can tell within a minute or two with most folks whether they don't really want to know the nuance of this. They've decided this is like, I can hit the jackpot with this. I'm going to get, a good byline on this. And then I just do what I can in the rest of the conversation to just try to harm reduction strategies. Right? Just try to get them to not screw it up so badly, because I know it doesn't really matter. They're not going to take the time. They're not even going to talk to me long enough to really get it right. And so I just immediately have a set of kind of things I want to say, sort of what I think people, what I've learned over time, they're going to go with this. And I say, you might think this, but no. There's this, no, and this is why. And then there are those who really do want to get it. Ophelia Casillas was a reporter at the Tribune. I think she might be one of these folks when Zell made all of his bad business decisions and they had to downsize. She lost her job. But I met her when she was brand new, and we said to her, come to Chapin Hall. She came and we talked to her. I had an ongoing series of conversations with her. She turned into one of the best reporters in the country, I think, on these issues. Wrote big, multi, issue, exposés on different topics in Illinois that I think were great public education, and got lots of column inches, right? Because she was doing good work. But she did her homework. She was a student, and got the early stories, like some kid, got abused, and she had to cover those things. And she'd do them, and there were mistakes early on, but she kind of stuck with it, and those are the folks I like to talk to. I'll give a lot of time to people like that. And I think there are researchers who won't, because who knows why they're doing what they're doing, but most of us will, actually. So.
That's my experience, for sure.
Yeah.
If you're genuinely curious, most people, at least in your line of work, are dying to talk to you.
Yeah, that's right.
One of our biggest challenges is actually speaking with social workers. There's a lot of us in the room, and yet we don't understand the extent of our confidentiality and what it requires. We don't want to threaten or exploit the relationships we have with our clients. And yet both of you guys mentioned what great sources we are. It's something we've definitely been struggling with. If we have a responsibility to our interviewees, let's say former kids in the system, we have a responsibility to the researchers and speak with them directly. What's our responsibility with social workers? We had a LA County worker with us here, Jennifer Lopez, who gave an amazing presentation, told us everything she could about child abuse and removal. It was kind of traumatizing for us. And then when we talked with her after class, she said, yeah, but if a reporter came to me, I'd tell them they have to go to our PR department. And just curious if you guys have any ideas around how you've managed to have relationships with folks in the field that were able to give you information and ideas that you could use in a meaningful way.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not a reporter, right? So, I mean, I have relationships with all kinds of frontline child welfare workers and managers and administrators and stuff like that, and I don't out them. That's one thing, right? But I think it's a different ask than a reporter. I mean, typically when a reporter is asking, an employee of an organization, it's not just social work, by the way. There's, go work for corporations, and you're off the record. I mean, you're basically kind of, insubordinate, frankly, to have those conversations. So I can't really speak for journalists in that regard. That's tough. But I mean, for researchers, I think it's kind of part of what we do. A lot of what I do is particularly work where I'm working with folks where we're doing some qualitative work, is it's bearing witness to things. And we kind of have to do that. It's our job, right? And, I don't find social, we do focus group. There are ways to do things that allow people to talk, and to not, out individuals. And also, it's kind of what's the purpose of your work? I mean, you hear me dish here about, I'm saying, well, these counties, some of them aren't going to do it, because I hope I'm wrong, but I think that's true. But I don't see my work as about getting anybody, right? I'm not in the getcha business, because I don't think that's a particularly good way for me to be effective. I'm more about, I do believe even the worst of these places ultimately have potential for getting better. And I'm trying to do work in that spirit. And so I don't generally have a whole lot of problem engaging people. Even when the news is really bad. The Midwest study, like you're reading it, use it for like, think if you're the state administrator, even in Illinois, let alone Iowa and Wisconsin, where I didn't know this, but believe me, the last thing people like human services people in Iowa or Wisconsin want to hear is that Illinois is doing better than us. Because they all believe that Illinois is like the race politics, all kinds of things get into that. The fact that, services would be better than Illinois and Wisconsin, that is just unconscionable thought in Wisconsin. But, they didn't ever shoot the messenger. I got invited to go talk about the latest wave of the Midwest study at their big child welfare conference. Because our attitude is, okay, we're here to bear witness to this so you can get better. And we always unlike, you guys wouldn't necessarily do this, journalists, but I always give them the information and they have a lot of time to think about it and think about what they're doing differently now, before I go public, right? Because I'm not in gotcha mode, right? So I think it's a bit different, really, for researchers than journalists. Because journalists aren't, and nor they should be, waiting around for the agency. You ask the agency, what do you think about this? You don't say, well, I'll wait a couple weeks to run the story until you guys come up with a plan, to rectify this. I mean, that's news 2 weeks from now, right? Oh, they came up with a plan in response to our story. But
Yeah, I mean, it's a chess game. I mean, one thing is that as reporters have a lot to prove to people if they want any trust. I mean, and that makes sense. I would want to talk to a reporter. I mean, who would? You're put on the spot. What you say is going to be out there in the world, and these days forever and easily accessible. It's a scary thing, and I think respecting that is a good start when people get the sense that you respect it. Again, curiosity is a big deal. If somebody gets the sense that you're actually curious about what they're doing, but it's taken me a long time to develop relationships with with the people in the child welfare field. It was really difficult I'd been working in the child welfare field for years, and I thought this is going to be a piece of cake. It's not a piece of cake. It's really difficult to get people to actually.
You're not one of us anymore.
Well, it depends. I mean, you can act like it. You find out, where social workers go drinking on Friday, and you can find people in situations like that and get friendly. But I mean, ultimately, what it boils down to is doing enough work and not demanding the world from these sources right away. What everybody in child welfare wants you to do is to do like a portraiture of their organization and all the good work that they're doing. And that's what schools want, and everybody. And I always tell people, I don't really do that. I mean, that's your job. Like I didn't come here to. I mean, it's like if you taught a bunch of kids really, really well today, that's not really news. Some things are extraordinary.
Well, it is really news.
What's that?
It is really news, unfortunately.
Well, sure. And actually, and occasionally you tip your hat to that, but sometimes you have to do a few stories like that. I'm not saying you write puff pieces, but I'm saying you don't necessarily go to the source for the first time when you're ready to do a story that's just going to tear the throat out of our organization. You know what I mean? What are you guys working on? What's going on around here? And you chip away, and you write the stories you can, so that when it's time to rip the throat out of an organization, you've got somebody who will talk to you about why that's happening.
Have you ripped the throat out? I mean, other than those three, the pack of group homes, is there any other outstanding case of
Any other throat?
absolute throat ripping?
Oh, I don't want to give myself too much credit. Throat ripping sounds pretty badass,
Okay.
but
Decapitation, maybe.
the San Francisco School District is not happy with the basics.
Yeah.
So.
Well, why don't you just give a brief rundown of that, and then how are you going to develop sources? So, okay, in this context, if we were to run around and do these kind of, I mean, this is like my relationship with LA County DCFS was very antagonistic initially, and now it's not so antagonistic after having to, kind of crazy reparations. I don't know how that happened, but it was bad in the beginning. I mean, I had a blind quote. Somebody said, "Oh, their PR department is like a bunch of cockroaches. They'll be living after the nuclear holocaust." And I put that in as a blind quote, and they were not very happy with me for quite a while. So how are you going to ever recultivate sources?
It's a good line, but probably doesn't endear you to the agency.
No.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, everybody's familiar with the Fostering Media Connections and all the work that they, and at this point, you can go and get the worst data about somebody and then put it into narrative or one of your newsletters or something like that in such a sort of compelling, we're all coming up together in foster care and
Well, hey,
you
that's
can
not
matter.
fair.
It's like even bad data comes out looking like an opportunity
No,
when you
no,
write
no.
about it. I mean, I think it
Well,
does.
bad data is an opportunity to write something.
It is. I think it's terrific.
Yeah, I mean, it just gets some people,
You know.
get some people going on. But no, but really, I mean, going after some, you put these guys on their backs, and I think that that's important function of journalism. So how are you going to go get them back?
You don't get them back, but the thing is, I mean, if it's somebody that is operating off taxpayer dollars, at some point they have to talk to you. They have to say something, or if they don't, it's only going to make it worse. And there's always the other thing is, we did a story about school district embezzlement, and we did about 10 stories about that. And when those stories came out, they set up a containment strategy at the district for our organization, and basically, if I wanted to know what kind of milk they were serving in school that day, they'd make me fill out a records request in 2 weeks. But the good thing is there's a lot of teachers in school, and they're not all happy about their job either. And so they start calling and sending you stuff, and you sort of worm your way back in. There are also some really good things happening in the San Francisco school districts. I wrote about a couple of those, and it got their PR people to start calling about it.
Yeah.
That simple.
Yeah.
I have a question for Trey about how you talk to sources, how you find your sources who are former foster youth. The selection of articles that we were given to read, I thought was kind of interesting in combination with the research of Mark's that we read, because it seemed like probably the subjects would be characterized more in the categories of more stable youth as opposed to the struggling parents or the troubled and troubling. And I don't know if that's just, I'm not sure if the articles that we read were representative or if it's just sort of easier to reach those groups and they're more likely to talk to you, or maybe you feel more of a sense that it's more ethical to talk to those.
It's a bit of both. I mean, honestly, I think that I'm not sure exactly what you were given to read.
Jennifer. It was about Jennifer, and then
Right.
AB12, and you mentioned.
Right, and those were very early on when I started this beat, and so what I had done was gone through and contacted every child welfare lawyer I could find, talked to CASA, talked to every agency I could find, and just said, look, I want access to some cases I can write about, and so those did come a little more easily. I mean, at this point, I have foster kids reach out to me sometimes. That's very, very tricky. I mean, the last thing that I want to do is approach a kid who I know is in crisis and try to convince him that somehow by talking to me, he's going to make things better. Why should he care or she care about helping anybody else? I mean, that's really not the case. What I'll do sometimes is I'll talk to people that work with those kids, and get a real sense of where this kid is at. One thing I refuse to do is use the last name of a kid, even if they're coming to me, if they're under 18, which is a ridiculous way to chop it, but that's what I can get away with. If they're under 18, I just won't use their last name, because even if they're coming to me saying, hey, I'm 17 years old, I got this, the scoop on the system, or I want to tell you about this, I just feel like they don't have an understanding of what it's going to mean to have their full name Googleable in the context that they're talking about. But yeah, I mean, kids approach me sometimes. People, for instance, from CASA or other organizations will tell me about a kid, but I try not to make the kids the focus of the story anymore. And in a hard news way, that's very easy to do. If a kid leads me to a story, there's something going on around him, that tells us something about the system that he's in, and that's actually the story. We want people in the stories, but I mean, I'm not really in the business of writing profiles of poor abused foster kids anymore either.
I have a question for Mark. By your data, it seems like there's 45% of kids coming out of foster care that are not going to those could be, or that are troubled and
43,
and then
yeah, give or take,
the
right?
needy parents, right?
Uh-huh.
So have you? And you said that they can self-identify at age 18 as being likely to.
The trouble and troubling group, pretty much, yeah, they're pretty easy to identify. I mean, self-identified, but we could identify them pretty easily, yeah.
By risk factors. So what could be done, in your opinion, at age 18 to prevent that trajectory from happening at 26?
Well, for one thing, for the Trouble and Troubling group, I think there's stuff, I mean, in my study, they were all in care at 16 and we were following them, right? So, you know, the mental health and substance abuse problems they have, particularly managing anger and external behavior, you know, getting into trouble. There are actually a growing number of evidence-based interventions that we have, you know, that we could apply much better in the child welfare system than we are. That's a whole other discussion. Some journalists someday should write about how it's taken us 20 years and we're still not there, of taking some basic science that we knew 20 years ago and getting it better implemented in the foster care system. But I think we could, you know, we're not going to solve, it's like we were talking earlier, it's not, you're not going to make that go away, but we do have some interventions with young people and their caregivers, so their foster parents or even their birth families, that could help them manage those behaviors a lot better, reduce their likelihood of continuing substance abuse problems, etc. So I think there's a lot of that we want to do. You also have to address educational deficits. There's a lot of stuff we could do better in foster care with older youth in foster care. Don't get, you know, you'll hear a lot of folks say that who aren't even interested in extending care, right? Well, we just need to do foster care better. I totally agree with that. Right? And then recognize that for some of those young people, we're going to be providing intensive services for them for some time. So this idea we're going to close all the residential care group homes down, right? I get the argument for that, and you know, there's some great examples of where that's been done, and it's really not a good thing. I mean, Illinois was very successful doing that. The average number of placements of kids who went into some kind of group care setting doubled in a period of 5 years, though. So by the end of that successful period of reducing the use of residential care, the average kid going into any kind of residential care setting had moved between 7 and 8 times. It shouldn't take 7 or 8 failed placements to figure out we need to do something else. Now, I'm not even saying you necessarily have to do residential care, but whatever we're doing, it isn't working, right? So I think with that group, there's actually a lot of stuff we could do differently, and some of it we're going to have to continue to do after they're 18, right? For the struggling parents group, and we're just now starting to invest in this, and I'm happy to say I think our research played some role in that. The federal government's actually creating pregnancy prevention programs, pregnant parenting team programs for youth in foster care, which I think is the way to go. And let's take some evidence-based interventions. There's not a lot in pregnancy prevention, but there are some. This is a well-targeted population. We know where they live. 20% of them will have a kid already at 17, okay? Half by 21. Let's try to bring that down, right? Particularly for that struggling group. And then for those who have kids, let's, you know, we have a bunch, again, we have some evidence-based interventions around supportive parenting, right? So I think we've got to do those things early and often. And unfortunately, up until very recently, focusing on the well-being of kids in care is at a policy level is non-existent. It was all about get them out, keep them safe. When I talk to the audience, that's right. You understand what the child welfare system is about? It's about 2 things. One, it's about keep them from getting hurt. Stay out of the newspapers, the way I summarize that. Stay out of the newspapers by keeping them from getting hurt. So that's the safety side of it, right? And then the other part is get rid of them. They're in care. Well, we're not going to be able to send them home now. Get rid of them some other way. And I hate to say it, but that summarizes pretty well the philosophy of the child welfare system in a lot of places for reasons that I'm quite sympathetic to, actually. You know, that there's not enough money. You know, it isn't their policy. There is no really explicit policy around well-being yet. Nothing, really. It's kind of not there. But the older youth stuff, the Fostering Connections Act, but even before that, the Chafee Foster Care Independence Act, by moving in the direction of tracking well-being outcomes, which we're only starting to do, by the way, this year, even though the law passed in 1999, right? That will force the system to start looking at this stuff more. So, counties and states will start looking at education, mental health, etc., because they're going to look really bad on those outcomes at 19 and 21, even 17. You know, unfortunately, this state did a pretty lousy job of collecting its baseline National Youth Transition-based data, has a lousy response rate and everything. But those data tell you a lot about the well-being of young people. And then you can begin. You should start earlier, but if you've got to start at 17, that's better late than never. And I think that we're going to see a lot more well-being focused interventions and work and just basic social work going on in the child welfare system, both because of that and frankly Brian Samuels and Barack Obama. I mean, and the administration, their focus is largely around well-being of kids in foster care and the well-being of kids that come up against the system. These kids have mental health problems even if they don't in care. Let's figure out how to do that. So that's a good thing. That's actually a very good story that's in the making right now. It'd be great for journalists to bear witness to that.
If you looked in the newspaper 50 years ago, you'd think that there was no such thing as foster care or child abuse. There was no real foster care. You'd think there was no child abuse. You'd think that kids were not in danger in their own homes and those types of things. So, I mean, if things have gotten radically better in the last, 50, definitely the last 30 years. So you look at policy changes, more people doing social work, more understanding of what's happening. And despite the drought of media coverage, a lot more media coverage every year. So I think that's absolutely right, that there is a way to look at this sort of optimistically and feel like, of course, we're sending kids into foster care, into group home placements and places where nobody's participating in their healing. They're being warehoused, they're being kept safe and kicked out. But that's less the case now than it was 10 years ago.
When I practiced, started in the field, I started in '85. In '86, we passed the Independent Living Initiative, right, which came out of people paying attention to these outcomes. What was the goal of that? We're going to make them independent, give them services and soft skills, and they'll have independent living skills, so they'll be independent at age 18, they'll be self-sufficient. Well, you can tell from the tone of my voice, I think that was kind of a silly prospect, even then, right? But hey, that was something. I mean, at least they were acknowledging that we're not doing something we need to do, right? But the goal is independent, self-sufficient at 18. Fast forward to '99, the Foster Care Independence Act, which in some ways was better in the sense that it fixed some holes and more money, and maybe we need to provide some housing, and we need to provide medical care. But now we've even shifted the lingo a little bit from independent living to independence from foster care. Like, oh, really? Once they leave foster care, they're independent of foster care. I mean, it's at a fundamental philosophical level, I think, is silly and failed policy. Fostering connections is a fundamental change. It is a fundamental change in federal policy. The language, we're going to foster connections with adoption, but we're going to support and we're going to help success. Fostering connections is success. And the law says, hey, states, you can actually continue to parent young adults because that's a normative thing to do. If you had told me 20 years ago that would happen, I would have said you were nuts. Particularly if you had told me you're going to expand a federal entitlement in 2008. Absolutely would have told you were nuts. So yeah, I think this is a very good story here.
I mean, how much do you think that, so specific to those covering foster care, how much historical context do you, because I mean, at some point I started realizing that there was history beyond 2 years ago, and that kind of helped. And then, later on I started realizing it goes back, for a while, and you can kind of understand how policy develops and practice develops, and that's really important for the contextualization of this stuff. So generally speaking, I mean, I see potentially a positive outcome being that this is a field where you could get more context, and that would permeate other fields of journalism, right? Because I don't think people are doing that really understanding historically how things work. No. And do you think, from your experience talking to reporters, and Trey just said there's more of us, I guess, out there covering this stuff, but do you think that there's, I mean, or maybe there aren't, but do you think that reporters are is that flatline, or is there a historical understanding of things changing, or is it flat?
Oh, I think it depends on the reporter. I mean, there's more reporters doing this, and I think there's more of them that are staying with it long enough, right, to understand that this is deep stuff. This goes back to 19th century, we don't like these immigrant parents, and we're going to save their kids. I mean, that's what we're talking. There's a lot that has not changed at all at a fundamental philosophical level, between the debate between child savers and family preservationists, right, if you like, or parents' rights folks. I mean, so there's actually a lot of great stories there. If you stick around long enough, you absolutely can write a book that a lot of people will read. Talk to Nina Bernstein. Great book, if you haven't read that, The Lost Children of Walden. And she was a New York Times writer, and she stuck with it long enough that she, figured out some really important subtext to a story about a particular kid, right, in New York City. But the book is brilliant in terms of laying out long history of the evolution of the child welfare system in New York and situating it in broader public debates over the sanctity of the family, the ability of the state to do, intervene effectively. There's a lot there. You want to talk about race politics in the U.S.? You can do no better than the child welfare system. You want to talk about poverty? Bingo, right? And there's a lot of stuff. If you have a long-term project as a journalist, so you want to be able to really dig in deep to approach a lot of different social issues through this lens, I think. And there are some people who will be around long enough to do that, but most of them aren't, for all kinds of reasons.
Maybe we'll get some of them.
There's one more. Oh, we are done actually.
Yeah, we're basically done, but I really want to thank you guys for coming out and joining us.
Thanks for having
It's, these conversations seem to go, I don't know, maybe everybody else is horribly bored, but I definitely feel like these conversations go by much faster than I would like. You're laughing at me. But at any rate, I really do appreciate it, so thank you guys very much. Thank you.